everybody. My talk's got a Welsh slant because I chaired the group that produced a set of recommendations for Welsh Government on the policies it should adopt to facilitate national residential decarbonisation. We had a 30-strong team drawn from across Welsh society. It spent 15 months developing its recommendations. They are underpinned by some serious analytical work at the Welsh School of Architecture, looked at the entire Welsh housing stock and what it was capable of, and also by the insights of a team from the UCL Centre for Behaviour Change, and they played a very important part in our thinking. Welsh Government, I'm happy to say, has accepted all our recommendations, and we're now in prepare for delivery mode, delivery being targeted to begin in summer 2021. One of the challenges we face is a legacy of policy flip-flops by successive UK governments. In the 17 years since 2002, residential energy policy in the UK has changed 13 times, and that's not counting all the little tweaks that occurred within the Green Deal. Now that's discouraged investment by industry and uptake by homeowners, and is one of the reasons why the UK lags behind most other European countries in the rate at which residential energy consumption has reduced. Ahead of myself. Our first recommendation was that the political parties should make a commitment to national residential decarbonisation and stick to it. Right now, that concept and the strategy we're adopting do have cross-party support, and we're working hard to maintain that. This is the current distribution of EPCs in Welsh housing. I think it's pretty similar to the English ones. And our first technical recommendation is every single home in Wales, with a few acceptable fails, but not very many, should be raised to EPC A by 2050. And to catalyse that, our recommendation is that Welsh Government urgently begins a 10-year programme to bring every socially owned home and every privately owned home in fuel poverty up to EPC A by 2030. That means upgrading, on average, 30,000 homes per year for a decade within Wales. This will be expensive, and we have said to Welsh Government, you have to find the necessary money to make this happen. And they've said, OK, we'll do that. Looking after the poorest and most vulnerable in society is not simply the right thing to do. We also believe it will benefit everyone, and that's because upgrading 300,000 homes in Wales by 2030 will give firms in the retrofit industry the confidence and the opportunity to invest, to train, to take on apprentices, to take on new staff, to innovate and drive down costs. And it'll also provide valuable data on how well different aspects of what we're trying to do actually work, and that will help continuous improvement. The goal is that by the mid-2020s, the retrofit offer will be attractive to private homeowners, provided that action is taken to ensure that these people have the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to decarbonise their homes. We need decarbonising a home to be as easy, as desirable, and as socially normal as having a new kitchen or bathroom. We made a series of other recommendations to Welsh Government about the actions that it and others should take to create an environment in which it's socially normal for homeowners to choose to upgrade their homes, and easy to do so well. Trust is absolutely vital, which is why so many UK schemes have failed. When Welsh Government launches this massive programme in the summer of 2021, it's important that funders, owner-occupiers, social and private landlords, industry must all trust that it is and will continue to be supported by all the political parties in Wales for 3 decades. Keeping it local is important. We want advice, funding, design and installation all to be local. The bulk of the work needs to be carried out by small and medium-sized firms that are based in local communities and trusted by the people that they serve. Quality is important. The advice given must be good, the design must be good, the installation must be good. We've recommended the collaborative creation of a Welsh quality regime that works for everyone involved. Continuing to learn is important. We recommended that Welsh Government creates a substantial fund so that all promising ideas, both technical and particularly non-technical, are researched first, then piloted at small scale, and then, if they get through the pilots, their field trial at larger scale. We need to be as sure as possible that ideas will work before they're rolled out across the nation. And the involvement of communities is really important. Residential decarbonisation is, in the jargon, a wicked problem. Wicked problems are often imperfectly understood, so they need to be much more widely discussed to ensure a fuller understanding of their complexity and interconnection. So we've recommended that maximum use is made of the many trade, professional, voluntary, community and third sector organisations in Wales. Asset-based community development has an important part to play in decarbonisation in Wales. So this is what we think the uptake of the socially owned homes and privately owned homes in fuel poverty might look like. It follows the S-shaped curve that all previous home improvements have followed as their uptake increases. And we hope that by the middle of this decade, private homeowners will start to upgrade their homes, and we're guessing again that it'll follow an S-shaped curve a bit like that, going out to 2050. And if you add the two curves together, you get that. Now it's clear, therefore, we don't want a dip in the late 2020s, so we're going to have to introduce measures to accelerate uptake by early adopters. I mentioned the UCL Centre for Behaviour Change. They taught us some very powerful analytical techniques for understanding what needs to happen so that owner-occupiers and private landlords have the capability and the opportunity and the motivation to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. And these two groups are crucial because between them they own over 80% of the homes in Wales, also the UK, and therefore are responsible for over 80% of residential greenhouse gas emissions. Now I'll illustrate their approach with just one simple example, and that's of a homeowner taking out a loan to fund an energy efficiency improvement. So there's the desired behaviour, that the owner takes out the loan. Now to take out the loan, the homeowner has to have the capability to take out the loan. I mean, it's simple stuff, but it's actually fundamental. Has to have the capability to do it, has to be motivated to do it, and finally has to have the opportunity to do it. And there are all sorts of organisations that influence what homeowners do, just 3 of them here, who need to behave in particular ways so that homeowners have capability, opportunity, motivation. First of all, there's things that Welsh Government needs to do. There's things that the small builders, installers that we all interact with all the time need to do. And there's things that retail banks and building societies need to do. There's other groups as well, but there's just not room for them on the slide. Now, identifying all the actors and their potential interventions is an important and continuing area of work for us. This is a work in progress behavioural systems map of private landlords. How private landlords will behave will be directly influenced by the actions of Welsh Government, local authorities, tenants, the Landlord Licensing Authority, banks and building societies, retrofit assessors and designers, builders and installers. We want all of those groups to behave in particular ways to make it that much likelier that private landlords do choose to upgrade their homes. Money, of course, is at the heart of it. Welsh Government is appointing its own Green Finance Task Group to identify what funding needs to be available and how across all tenures, and it's liaising closely with the newly established UK Green Finance Institute, which I'm happy to say is Welsh-led, so we're in there rather well, I think. There are still a few people who say this is all too expensive, and I think there's a number of answers to that. First, we do know that inadequate action or no action will be much more expensive, and that we'll be signing a bill for our children and our grandchildren to pay. Second, the residential repair, maintenance and improvement market in Wales is worth over £1 billion a year. That's more than will be needed to upgrade all our privately owned homes. Third, Wales has got some very particular legislation that you may have heard of that requires every public body in Wales to take explicit account of the well-being of future generations. The benefits to Wales of residential decarbonisation will be widespread and will easily outweigh the cost and are entirely consistent with the goals of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So our approach is not simply to focus on carbon, but to maximise the social and economic as well as environmental benefits that will flow from decarbonisation. Study after study has shown the excellent economic multiplier effects, and any Treasury seed money that Wales may request will be paid back through increased taxes as the able to pay get stuck in. But that does require Treasury to take a long view, and some may say that's going to be difficult. So we've got a lot of work to do before the beginning of the next Welsh parliamentary session in the summer of 2021. We've identified you're not supposed to be able to read this, it just shows a lot of work. We've identified about 50 projects that need to be undertaken between now and then so that Wales is ready and able to embark on a transformational programme that will benefit every citizen. So my conclusion is, with the exception of BEIS, who I think are very good, I do not hold out much hope for UK government to lead. It's too distant from the people it's elected to serve, it's not joined up internally, and the electoral system discourages policy continuity. I think residential decarbonisation will happen because Wales and Scotland and city regions and cities are getting on with it. So my policy asks of UK government are, one, make sure that Treasury provides any seed money that is requested, and two, keep out of the way. And if it can't stop itself from interfering or from intervening, it should ask itself one question every time it's tempted to intervene. Will this intervention make it more or less likely that private homeowners will choose to upgrade their homes and find it easy to do so? Thank you very much.
Okay, morning everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm Sarah Fletcher from the GLA, and I'm just going to take you through an overview of the context in London, what the Mayor is doing to take action, and where I think that leaves us and what the challenges are, and thus what we will be looking for from central government. So, just by way of context, in May 2018, the Mayor published his London Environment Strategy. It was the first ever strategy in London that brought together all the different strands of the environmental sector. So there's a variety of different elements in there that relate to green space, infrastructure, waste and recycling. In relation to energy, the headline elements were around zero carbon by 2050, whilst also trying to protect those who are vulnerable from the effects of fuel poverty. So in terms of the context for London, I think it's something that isn't necessarily well recognised, but London has the highest level of fuel poverty since records began, and in fact we are seeing that fuel poverty is increasingly becoming an urban phenomenon. So in Newham there's the highest levels of fuel poverty found anywhere in England, and 7 of the top 10% of areas in fuel poverty are London boroughs. That is exacerbated by the fact that London housing stock is expensive and challenging to treat. So we've got really high levels of solid wall properties, we've got a large number of flatted properties, half of England's conservation areas are in England, and we've got a really large and growing privately rented sector. All of those things play through to some of the challenges that we've got and some of the asks that we have of government in terms of how we can address those issues. And then it's fair to say that the challenges that exist with the housing stock that we've got and the high levels of fuel poverty are exacerbated by the fact that London has consistently lost out through the supplier obligations. I've put up an example in relation to the most current one, the energy company obligation, but it's fair to say that it's a historical problem. So London puts in significantly more through the levy that's put on everyone's energy bills than we get out in funding. So the example is pretty stark in relation to the energy company obligation. We have a shortfall of about 60.4 million a year annually, and that is not changing, and actually it's getting worse. So the most recent figures, we're down to about 3.4% share. So in terms of the actions that the Mayor's taking, I'm just going to take you through a few of the programmes that we've got. So the first one is the Retrofit Accelerator for Homes. It's a technical advice programme that aims to transform the way that we engage with our housing stock. It's primarily related to the social housing sector, but we have some area-based elements in it. and it's about looking at a smaller number of properties, so about 1,600 homes, but looking to do it in a way that really goes to a very high level of retrofit. So if we can't get the home all the way there in the first approach, then we look to take a no regrets approach, but we are trying to get homes to net zero. We hope also that this will allow us to be able to help support the development of the supply chain, which we know is going to be absolutely crucial to be able to get to zero carbon. Within that, one of the projects that we're running is Energy Leap, a pilot of Energy Sprong, and the next speaker is going to be talking in more detail about that approach. Then the next programme is Warmer Homes. It's the Mayor's flagship fuel poverty programme. It provides up to £4,000 per home, but the difference is that we've moved away from the loft and cavity measures-based approach, and we're taking a holistic approach. So we have a retrofit coordinator who does a holistic whole house assessment, and then we try to identify and address all of the issues that are present within the home. So in the first phase of Warmer Homes, the single biggest measures that went in were still related to heating, but the third biggest measure was related to ventilation, damp, mould, which we know that are both issues in relation to the health of the home, the health of the residents, and also are going to impact upon the ability of the energy efficiency measures to be able to work properly. That is supported and complemented by the Warmer Homes Advice Service. It's the first ever pan-London fuel poverty service that exists. It's run by 3 boroughs, so we provide support directly to Islington, Kensington and Chelsea and Lewisham, and together they provide a joined-up service. And this is really to provide referrals that are really good quality into the programme. So they have networks of people who've got links into all different parts of the community, and so they support it with referrals into Warmer Homes, but they also provide support more broadly to address some of the other drivers of fuel poverty. So they will help people to maximise their income through benefits, and they will also do what they can in relation to helping people address their high energy costs, which is the other obvious driver of fuel poverty. Then we have a programme which is Sharing Cities, and so this is a domestic demand-side response programme, and so we're looking to take a systems-led approach to address how we can decarbonise buildings, but also how we can introduce flexibility into domestic programmes. This, we know that flexibility and the ability to reduce carbon emissions can be substantial through the use of flexibility. So we're really delighted to be working on this project. And then just finally, in relation to our programmes, Solar Together London. It's in its 3rd phase now, and it's a collective purchasing scheme for solar. So it allows people to enter into a reverse auction, and the idea is that the more people we have participating, the lower we can get the costs. So we've run 3 phases now, and we've managed to secure reductions of between 20 and 35%. And I think it's really important to recognise that although these are still quite small scale, so the first 2 had 624 homes across the 2 phases, but we haven't put in a subsidy. This isn't about the Mayor subsidising the costs. This is about us providing a mechanism and the market being able to come forward with a solution. So those are the things that we're doing, but as you can see, there's still quite the mountain to climb. So I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this slide, because I think it is really good at demonstrating the scale of the challenge, but obviously for the same reason I really hate it. So the tiny little blue bit is the cumulative activity across all mayoral programmes and also across all the supplier obligations in London. And the amount of work and energy and thought that has gone into that very small little piece of activity is absolutely immense, and it's quite clear that from that trajectory we can't just continue to do what we've always done. The trajectory assumes that to get to zero carbon by 2050 we need to be decarbonising about 100 to 160,000 homes a year. And I think it's also worth noting that in the programmes that we have had to date, both in the supplier obligations and the Mayor's programmes, that they have been very light touch interventions, and we also know that they haven't necessarily been very good quality. So in the first phase of Warmer Homes, we've had to go back and correct problems that were created during the first phases of Eco, CERT, etc. So we've had to replace boilers that had been put in. So some of the assumptions that are in there about carbon savings that we think we've got, we know that we haven't actually got. I think it's also worth noting that those programmes were much more generous in terms of who was eligible. So although programmes like the Energy Company Obligation are targeted at people who are in fuel poverty, that definition has got a lot narrower. So what we would now contemplate as the able-to-pay sector includes many people at the edges who in previous times we would have considered to be in fuel poverty and would have been able to receive support. So actually, when we think about the able-to-pay sector, I think we need to recognise that it's a really big sector that is quite broad and going to have very different challenges. We have the minimum energy efficiency standards, or MEES, for the privately rented sector. So that is supposed to drive action in the privately rented sector. In London, about 30 to 40,000 properties are covered by MEES. So even if every single property that was covered by MEES improved to the standard that we need to get them to, then that is just a fraction of what we need to do in 1 year. And we know that even though those properties are quite poor and the turnover is likely to be quite bad, that there are a lot of problems with MEES. So we don't have very good enforcement and we don't have very good knowledge. So when I have a look at the MEES exemption register, there's only about 100 or so properties in London who have registered an exemption. And I know that given the level of the cap, more could do it. But because it isn't being highlighted, people aren't even registering as exemptions. That's even more problematic because, as you can see from this chart, a large proportion of the F&G properties are actually owner-occupied, so they're not caught by any regulations whatsoever. And the owner-occupier sector is generally worse performing than the social housing sector, and it's also, although the privately rented sector is worse on average, there are more owner-occupied properties in the who are F&G rated than PRS. So the fact that we don't have any regulatory drivers for them is a clear issue. And then just finally, to give you a sense of some of the other challenges, 1/5 of homes on the basis of the EPC, which we recognise have got a significant amount of problems, won't even reach Band C. So about 2/3 of homes wouldn't get to EPC Band D on the basis of the recommended measures. We need to have a holistic approach, and homes need to obviously be able to go beyond the EPC recommendations. And given the constraints of London's building stock, we recognise that actually a lot of properties, just to get to the sort of aggregated target, are going to need to go substantially further. So then that brings me on finally to where we are in relation to government. So, clearly we have a very long way to go in terms of what is needed. We don't have the regulations that are going to drive performance in the privately rented sector. We don't have a trajectory for an improvement to the current levels of MEES. We don't have any regulations that are going to drive performance in relation to the privately rented sector. We don't have funding, and there are a variety of ways in which funding is acting as a barrier. So most obviously the scale of investment is absolutely substantial, and as I was talking about before, given we have a large number of people who are in fuel poverty, but also a large number of people that are not within the definition of fuel poverty but are actually in need of help, they are going to need some support, otherwise we simply aren't going to be able to get to the targets that we need. There's also an issue in relation to some barriers that finance brings about. So the current levels of VAT mean that we need to add 20%. There's clearly an opportunity, I think, to look at VAT to see if that can be made more useful. And there is also, I think, as I highlighted in relation to MEES, there's a need for more funding for local authorities. At the moment, local authorities simply aren't enforcing MEES. And if we're going to call for any regulations that are going to drive performance, we also need to recognise that local authorities need to be properly funded. Otherwise, we're simply going to be putting in place more regulations which are going to take up a lot of time to get on the statute books, and then they're not even going to be driving the performance that we think we need. And then I think finally there's something about the regulations and the support that we need to provide the move to quality. So there are a number of regulatory changes which are not very glamorous, but if we are going to get to zero carbon, whether it's through a regulated means or through finance, they're going to need to be unpicked. So there are things around leasehold, freehold issues in relation to properties that are going to need to be addressed. At the moment, they act as a massive constraint on the ability of building owners and occupiers to be able to make changes. There are a lot of issues in relation to planning. So solid wall, as I highlighted, is a huge issue in London, but also more generally. Ahead of the Green Deal, they put in place permitted development rights for solid wall that made it much clearer and made it much easier for people to be able to install solid wall. They took those rights away, and now we have a real patchwork, and that is simply not going to be enough, because industry needs to have some kind of security that it knows that it can provide the same solution in one borough or another. And then there's also something more generally around the supply chain. So we need to have quality so that we can be sure that we're going to be getting the carbon savings that we need. There have been welcome moves in relation to that with PAS 2035 and the retrofit coordinators, but we've still got a really long way to go to be sure that we're actually going to be delivering the carbon savings we think we're going to be getting. So I will leave it there and look forward to questions.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ron. I'm with Energiesprong. For those who do not know what Energiesprong is, we are a market development team, or actually a group of market development teams that operate in various countries to try to find a better solution to retrofit our current buildings to the standards that we see are required if we want to even get close to our carbon targets. Now, if that sounds a bit complicated, we'll get to a bit more detail later. But let me start here, because this is a net zero energy retrofit. This is a picture from the Netherlands, but I'll show some pictures from stuff that's been happening in the UK in a while. So this is a retrofit that brings an existing house to net zero energy. And what net zero energy means is that this house annually provides generates enough energy to provide the house with heating, hot water, and power for the use of electric appliances. This retrofit was executed in 1 week, and it came with a 30-year performance warranty on that energy performance, as well as on the indoor climate that is better than the new build standard. In the Netherlands, no subsidies were given. So this is a business case that the social landlord who owns this stock has paid by itself. And we've been doing, we've been doing a few thousand of these retrofits in the Netherlands currently, and are continuing to scale that volume up. Now, everybody, if I sometimes go to these kind of events, and then you hear these presentations, there's a lot of analysis about the problem, but the problem isn't really complicated in our view. The bottom line of the problem is that these houses, and you can argue the numbers a little bit, but high level, this house annually consumes, in the old case, 3,000 kilowatt hours for electricity and about 20,000 kilowatt hours for heating, hot water and space heating. Now, the problem is that if you look at where developments are going in sort of decarbonizing our economy, we're pretty advanced in decarbonizing our grid, which is great, but that only takes part of the 3,000 kilowatt hour problem. In most cases, it doesn't take the 20,000 kilowatt hour problem into considerations. There are electrically heated homes, but the majority in Northwest Europe at least are gas heated. And the real problem is that you can't just put an electric heater in most of them, because the amount of power and peak power that requires from the grid would just make that entirely unfeasible. So you gotta reduce the energy consumption. If you look at what basically this house is, this consumes 5,500 kilowatt hours on an annual basis for everything, and the large part clearly has been achieved by reducing energy and a little bit by using a heat pump, which obviously uses that energy more efficiently. And you know, whether this was an F, a G, an H, an I, an M, and an N, it doesn't matter whether the building was bad or really bad or really, really, really bad. You need to fix them anyway. So, you know, this is the space in which we need to move all of them. So the starting point, I don't really understand why that is always so important to people, right? We know it's way too bad, and that's just enough to know that you need something like this for all of them if we want to get to a target where we need to get to. So the whole label analysis, I'm like, right, we know it's not good enough, let's fix it, right? Now, I was on my way here and was just flicking through my slides on my phone, and a colleague of mine in the comms team was sitting next to me, and she was like, Ron, where are all the people? And I'm like, yeah, okay, fair point. The other problem we have in you know, events like this and people that think about it is that it's all kilowatt hours and all technology and all financing, and trust me, nobody cares in the real world. Nobody cares, right? So apart from fixing the energy situation, we gotta figure out a product that people actually want to either buy or own or live in. And what this picture, and that's why I always use this to start the conversation with, what this picture is about the cars that are in front of the houses and not about the houses. Because what we're actually trying to do is bring an outdated building stock into the 21st century. And do that in a way that people, you know, that people are attracted to the idea. And we can have a conversation about the design, but that's actually the conversation we should have, because then we're talking about stuff that people actually care about, right? So you need to find something that's affordable, that's effective to reduce the energy consumption, but it's most of all maybe a desirable concept to buy it, to own it, to live in it, right? So that's really what we are trying to do with Energiesprong, is create a market for products that fit that description. I talked about net zero energy. I said it's enough to heat the home, to provide it with hot water, and to power its appliances. So what we basically do is people get a bundle. So they get a house. In this case, this is for a social housing provider, which we sort of use as a launching market in all the countries we're working with. But it would be the same for private homeowners. So you basically get a home which says, okay, you can heat this home to 21 degrees throughout the year. You can consume 40 minutes of hot water. You get a bundle for powering your appliances. And if you stick to that bundle, like a phone plan, this house will be net zero energies, right? So you take the consumer use out of the equation and you just give a fixed bundle. People understand that. They have it with phones, or at least they used to have it with phones. Now it's unlimited everything, but they get the concept. If they want to use more, they can. It's fine. But this puts sort of a clear definition of what sort of that design standard can be, so that people don't start, I mean the people here, that you know, the companies, don't have to sort of tweak their technological standard every time to whatever a new consumer wants. This is the bundle, we standardize the way we design it, and we replicate it. Now, the font went a little bit off here, but now how do housing organizations and later private homeowners pay for this, right? Because obviously this looks like an expensive approach. Yes and no. What the idea is that because the energy performance is guaranteed, the energy savings are therefore also guaranteed. So what you can do is to say, okay, the future savings that will materialize, both in energy, in repairs and maintenance, you can basically bring them forward if you finance them cheaply, and you can invest more than you can normally. So the way it works from a tenant perspective in this case is that the tenant would pay rent to a housing association, or the homeowner in that way, and so this is the old situation. It would just pay rent to the homeowner, and it would pay its energy bill to the utility. Now after that refurbishment, it would still pay that same rent to that same homeowner, but it would get that energy bundle, that energy plan, and it pays for that energy plan the same amount that it used to pay to the utility for that same comfort standard. But now, instead of paying that to the utility, it pays that to the housing association. So that creates an extra revenue stream. Combine that with the repairs and maintenance budget that's on the building, they can invest a higher amount than they were used to. So it's all about, can you bring the future expenses forward, and can you assure that those future expenses will be diminished, and then can you finance that cheaply, and that allows you to spend more money. Now, as I said, we've been scaling this up in the Netherlands. These are some pictures of various designs, a lot of terraced houses that we have in the Netherlands, but also some apartment buildings. This is the first project that we retrofitted using the Energiesprong approach in the UK. This is in Nottingham. A few more of these buildings have been constructed. If you think the purple isn't really your cup of tea, this was the tenant's choice. The next ones have different colors, but it's at least about the right conversation. Do we like the design of it rather than some loft insulation or a high efficiency boiler that really, again, nobody outside, you know, the small niche we're part of is going to care about in the end. So that was Nottingham. Second project in Malden, done by a housing organization called Moat, and there is a third project going on in North Devon in the south, which will be completed soon. There is a further pipeline developing, so we basically did 10 houses in Nottingham 2018, then 100 units, the projects have been started in 2019, and now there is a further pipeline of around 1,000 units more in the UK in various levels of maturity to do this Energiesprong approach to as well. Now, I talked a little bit about what the solution, sort of the definition of the solution needs to be. Now, how do you get that solution in place within a week at a quality standard that allows you to guarantee it, and at a cost that allows you to pay for it? Now, obviously, that is not feasible if you keep doing things the way we are doing now. So we have to move away from a craftsmanship-based approach and use the technologies available to us that we deploy in every other sector almost that we know, which is industrialization. So that means no longer this stuff and much more this stuff. So we basically need to start manufacturing solutions off-site. This allows us to have much higher, a much more controlled environment, so the tolerances are closer. We can optimize that product time after time, and that will eventually, if the scale is right, drive down costs. That was sort of the facade example. This is about the energy part of the solution, because obviously there is some technology stuff in that building that we need to fit as well. This was the first attempt they had at trying to make a net zero energy retrofit, and then they started realizing this is going to take us forever, and you know, we have to walk up and down the stairs to fit that, and then the plumber forgets the right spanner and he needs to go back, and then, you know, this is going to never work or become much cheaper either. So they started sort of boxing these things together so that they could off-site manufacture them as well. This is a solution that allows sort of fitting them to the new facades from the outside, but that's obviously not always feasible. So there are other designs like these ones where you basically hoist them in and they fit in the roof system. This is what these units look like when produced. And the whole idea is that you bring costs down sufficiently. And the reason why these costs can go down enormously is not just because there is a lot of technological innovation happening here. There is a little bit of technological innovation happening, but the majority is just to take the inefficiencies out of the supply chain compared to how things are done now. If you take a heat pump, if a heat pump is produced in a factory, that thing costs way less than £500 to make. But by the time it's fitted in a house, you've paid £5,000, right? Because there are all these steps in between that sort of cost money, right? So the manufacturer, that goes through the national importer, then a local distributor, then an installer, and it's margin on margin on margin, who does a manual project, blah, 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 blah. £5,000. If that costs £5,000, we're never going to get to solutions that are affordable for people, right? So this stuff is not the way we can keep doing things if we want to bring these solutions within an affordable price range. If we would make cars in the way that we do buildings, like this car, it's euros, but you get the point. This car would really cost that, right? This is how the inefficiencies of the construction supply chain operate. And it's also sensible. I'm not saying, you know, everybody is bad that, you know, works in the in the construction supply chain, but if the supply chain is organized around individual projects, you can't get these efficiencies of scale that a car manufacturer can organize, because, you know, it just can predict a large stream of components that it can just organize that way more efficiently. And if you can get to that space, we can really start making these solutions significantly more expensive. We're not talking about 10 or 20%, but, you know, breaking them in half or more. Okay, so a little bit more about what we do as Energiesprong, because this is all about what should be, you know, these kind of solutions, this kind of new industry. That's great, but what we saw was that there isn't a place in the world where this is happening. And that means that there are barriers, because the technology is there, the demand surely is there, so why isn't anybody really cracking this? And what you see is everywhere that we at least looked, is there are so many actors that depend on other actors to act simultaneously for something like this to slot into place, that if you don't put an independent sort of market broker in the middle for a while, that market is not collectively going to move to the next phase. So that's kind of what we do. So we are teams that are independently funded, and say, okay, we know what the outcome needs to be. We know that there needs to be demand. We know that there needs to be a supply industry. We know that depends on whether you can finance it. We know that depends on whether the regulation allows for such a solution to come to the market. None of these four components are in the right place yet. But if we put these around the table and we say this needs to be the place where we need to go, and you need to do that, and you need to do that, and you need to do that, and they all look at each other and say, okay, if we all do this, this could work, and they all move at the same time, then we have a chance. So this is kind of the market broker role that the Energiesprong teams in 6 countries now are taking, including in the UK, where we basically work with social landlords to create that initial demand for a product that doesn't actually quite exist yet, right? That quickly installed guaranteed net zero energy retrofit that's off-site manufactured. We're going to go to the market and ask it anyway by volume. We look for innovative and forward-thinking construction companies that sort of understand, okay, if there is a little bit of runway and there is a bit of a business case that I can see scale up, I'll invest and I'll start sort of making that product. It's not going to be perfect the first time around, but I'm on our way there. We figure out what the optimal way to finance that whole constellation is, and we work with government to tweak the regulation to make some of this stuff easier or more beneficial to do in general. So that's kind of my bridge to the regulation thing and the government thing and the policy thing, which is a bit of the theme of what we are talking about here today. Now, this is don't bother trying to figure this graph out entirely, but this is a rough comparison of the efficiency of the building stock between the UK and Germany. It doesn't matter, it sort of goes from old houses to newer houses in both, but the categories are slightly different. The bottom line is look at the y-axis, right? The scale here, 0 to 600, this is units of energy per square area that on average you require. UK is 0 to 600, Germany 0 to 300, right? This is roughly, in the UK, your building stock is twice as inefficient as in a company as Germany. I'm just saying, it's not like it's not a problem here. It's probably one of the worst, it is the worst building stock in Northwest Europe, right, in terms of efficiency. So the problem is significant that we're trying to solve. Now, let's look at what the governments are currently roughly doing across a few markets to see where we are in terms of the policy landscape. And the nice thing about what we do is, we do this in 6 countries, and it's all about, yeah, but the interest rate there, and the grant there, and the housing stock regulation there, and blah, blah, blah. If everything is said and done, under the last line there is a number that housing companies can invest. And if you try to do the exact same thing with the same sort of building stock, with collective homeowners, that number roughly tells you, how friendly, let's say, the policy environment is towards putting these kind of solutions in the market. Now, if you look at an investment grant for landlords across the 3 markets, right? In the Netherlands, you roughly can get about 8K for something like this as an investment grant. In Germany, as of January this year, they give 40% investment grant to this high standard of retrofitting. In the UK, if you sort of scrape RHI and Eco, you might get to 2K. That's it. Cost of financing. We're working with social or collective homeowners because we can organize some initial scale there. Cost of financing in the UK are enormous. And you might think this doesn't really matter, right? Less than 1.5% in the Netherlands, 0.75% in Germany, and between 2 and 4% in the UK. But 1 percentage point difference is about £5,000 more or less that you can invest in something like this, right? That's just, and it's all about, is there a collective appetite to take risk? Clearly, all the money, I'm always saying, in the UK, all the money ends up in Canary Wharf no matter what you're doing, and that is also true here, right? The cost of financing are significant. So a lot of the money we spend goes to interest rates. This is really something that matters. Then you look at how much are the savings for consumers that you actually are generating by doing something, which adds to the business case. The more expensive gas is, the easier it is to do a retrofit like that because the more savings you generate, and if you can finance those, the more money you can invest. Gas prices for small consumers, 9 cents, 6 cents, close to 5 cents. So you have the cheapest energy in the UK, right? It's really, the whole fuel poverty thing is like, it's not a fuel poverty thing, it's a poverty thing, right? You have the highest income inequality in Europe, you have the lowest fuel prices. Something is happening there that has not to do with fuel poverty as it's a wider social phenomena. The problem is, this doesn't help the business case in the UK, right? Saving energy isn't beneficial enough compared to elsewhere. And I understand what people think. Yeah, but if we put 4 cents of taxes on this, everybody's going to go berserk. Yeah, maybe, but the Netherlands puts 4 cents of tax on it and gives a flat rate back. So if I pay my energy at the end of the year, I pay a lot of levies, but I also get 600 euros flat rate back because everybody gets 600 euros flat rate back on its energy bill. So it's kind of like the ETS where you grandfather an amount, it's a bit technical, and people sort of only pay that marginal cost. So if you do really well, you save the money. If you do really poor, you pay more. This makes a huge difference. Electricity prices. Okay, so then I come to the sort of the 5 main things that if you ask me what the UK government could be doing, which would be most effective. First, you had a very impressive approach with wind offshore. I don't know if people know this, but there was basically an agreement that over every volume, the amount of grant would be tapered back, and now it's self-supporting. If you would pour 250 million in this market, where you say over every volume of these net zero energy retrofit, we're going to taper back the amount of support we'll give, you condition a market in the right direction. So that approach would really, really work well here as well. Then there is an issue with VAT. Housing associations and council housing, which are your perfect starting market, are not treated equally in terms of how VAT applies to them. So for one, these solutions are just 20% more expensive than for the other. You gotta balance that out, because otherwise you're just cutting out that half of your launching market, which is a shame. Then this mechanism that I talked about before, you need to make that simple, right? So it needs to be easy for housing companies to charge the homeowner with that energy plan. It's possible, but it's too complicated still. Smoothing that regulation would really help housing organizations to move in this direction. The cost of financing, I mentioned this before. If the government would be able to just provide a collective guarantee of some sorts, as other countries all do, that would just make the business case so much more attractive compared to where it is now. And then finally, I understand not all houses can be treated maybe to this standard yet, but if you start saying, oh, we need to be at a C label by 2030, you're going to create such an enormous lockout of where we need to be. People start doing high efficiency boilers and a bit of loft insulation, and in 5 years they realize, ooh, we actually had to go to net zero to even get close to our target, so let's take that stuff out again because that's not suitable to the solution we need. You can't keep stacking measures here. So take that C label bandwidth thing out of your solution and look more precisely how ambitious you should set your targets and put the level of, and do the intervention that fits to the target that you need to hit eventually. So if we get this set of measures done, I think we would start accelerating the speed of high-level retrofits in the UK enormously. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Can I invite the speakers to come and take a seat on the stage, please? That leaves us with about 15 minutes or so for questions. And I think I'm going to throw it out to the audience first. Who gentleman over here?
Hello there, my name is Matt Howells from MySpace. Thanks to all the panelists for a fascinating debate. I think my question is probably best directed to Chris. We're talking about retrofit. Is it your opinion that regional governments, including Wales and the UK government, are getting the formula wrong in terms of setting up too much funding towards decarbonisation of new build housing, which we've never ever managed to do in large volumes, where that should be reversed and the greater volume of funding should be available for retrofit?
I think we need... John, I think we need both new build and retrofit to be to the same very high standard. I don't necessarily see a competition between the money that goes into retrofit and the money that goes into new build. If you look back at the, what was it called, the Zero Carbon Homes initiative a few years back, which finally the plug was pulled on, that was getting very, very close to parity with traditional Part L construction. But the plug was pulled at just the wrong moment. So I don't think it would take much effort to get new build costs just the same for the higher standards as for the current standards. Where I think the seed money from government is needed is in the social sector, in those parts of the economy that just can't afford to do it themselves. But I think by and large, private homeowners will be able to afford it themselves, and for all sorts of reasons, as long as they do it in a staged way, the costs will continue to drop as well.
Would you like to comment, perhaps?
So in London, the mayor is able to set higher standards, and we have been lobbying because the Future Home Standard has been looking allegedly to try and level up, but actually in London that would mean that there would be a lower standard for new build going forward than we currently achieve. So I think we're really keen to see that, given in London there's a really large demand for new build housing and for housing generally, that we don't lose that opportunity, because I think as difficult as it is to retrofit the existing buildings, creating buildings that we know we're going to have to go back and retrofit is really problematic. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do in relation to new build, as well as trying to drive up the standards, is also to drive up the evaluation and monitoring, and to try and make sure that we are getting the carbon savings that we think we're getting. We know that there's a real issue in relation to the performance gap for new build, and I think that if we draw back from the new build standards, it sends out all the wrong messages in relation to confidence around the determination of the government to take action. We've got lots of supply chains that are getting ramped up and are increasingly able to deliver. So although I think it's true to say that they are operating in different spaces, I think that the messaging isn't going to be very helpful, and I think that actually we need to be doing more on new builds rather than creating problems that we're going to have to be retrofitting in a few years' time.
Thank you. There's another question behind you, right at the back.
John Preston, the Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance. My question to the panel and actually to the audience, have any of you carried out a whole life cycle analysis of a retrofit project, taking into account the carbon costs of the measures you've installed?
No, but one of the projects that I illustrated up there that Wales is about to embark upon will be to research just that, so that we get the best balance between embodied carbon and lifetime carbon savings.
Yeah. So embedded carbon is relevant, but with houses that consume 20,000 kilowatt hours of thermal, it becomes very you're in that back quite quickly. What I sort of say is that I take the example of the iPhone. If you go to the Apple website, you can see sort of the specs of all the iPhones that were ever made, and at the very last row in that table, you see toxic materials, right? And then the first one will say lead-free, and then every time there is, now it's lead-free and it's some other heavy metal-free, and it started improving and improving to integrate less and less toxic materials when the innovation sort of progressed. And I think what I think is important is to say, if you want this to be perfect and all the embedded carbon needs to be minimized, you make the challenge so hard that we don't even get started. So I think what we have been trying to do is to say, let's first see if we can get an industrialized solution going, which really puts the NZU standard at the right benchmark, and then see how we can start changing materials to further reduce the embedded carbon in that package.
Sarah, you want to comment? Next question. There we go. We'll come to you too afterwards. Yeah.
Oh, hello, I'm Lynn Jones from the Cheese Project, and we do thermal imaging on all sorts of houses, including old and listed buildings. And I just want to say, I can't see anywhere in the whole of EcoBuild that has anything to do with the listed buildings. And it seems to me that if you're trying to retrofit a listed building, the planners are so draconian, there's no help. We can't use any modern materials to bring these buildings into the 21st century. What are your comments on listed buildings?
Sarah, do you want to start?
Not so much listed buildings as conservation areas. Certainly the planners in Wales now recognise that you can't have conservation trumping tackling climate change, and they're beginning to explore what solutions might be acceptable in conservation areas that'll maintain or enhance their distinctive character, but will help reduce carbon emissions. I suspect for a lot of listed buildings, there will be limits to what you can do, and we just have to accept that because they're just too precious to spoil.
Yeah, so I would agree that it's a real challenge, and I think that part of it is that we need to have a conversation about what that means in terms of what it is we're trying to protect and preserve, and what the implications of those choices are. And I think, when you look at some of the approaches that could be taken in relation to retrofit, they are genuinely transformative, and I don't think that there is much understanding of what that could look like in terms of our streetscapes. So, some of the examples that Rick was showing of how building stock could look after an Energiesprong type approach, that's a very different aesthetic to the one that we're used to in relation to lots of our homes. And I think that there isn't really much discussion about that and what the implications of that are. So, as Chris was saying, it isn't just an issue in relation to listed buildings, it's an issue in relation to conservation areas. And And I was talking before about how in London we've got half of the conservation areas in England are here in London, and we have 33 local authorities. And it's fair to say that although there is a general understanding and a recognition in boroughs, 28 of them have now declared a climate emergency and are in various stages of developing a climate emergency action plan. They don't have a shared view about what that means in relation to how they treat their building assets. And so what you then get is very different approaches from borough to borough. And that can be facilitated by the fact that we don't have guidance at central government level which is going to drive them in a particular way. So, for instance, some boroughs will take the approach that it's acceptable in a conservation area to have external solid wall on the back elevations of properties. Other boroughs won't take that view. So we don't have a clear view, and I think it's fair to say that there is reason to believe that that is shifting, but it's reliant upon individual officers being able to make that case. And if we are serious about retrofit, given the number of properties that are covered by this, then it's incumbent upon the government to actually be able to come forward with a more coherent approach going forwards.
Thank you. In front here. Yeah.
Hi, Will Hurst from the Architects Journal. We're running a campaign for reuse of existing buildings at the moment called Retrofirst. And I was interested, Chris, in your comments about your scepticism about central government and the action that it might take. Do you still feel like that, given that we've had the legally binding commitment to net zero by 2050, we've got the COP26 conference being held here coming up in November. Government's obviously looking for things to boast about there. We've seen big moves that they've done in the last few days on offshore wind and vehicles, etc., etc. So could you just explain a bit more about why you're sceptical about central government? And I'd like to know if the rest of the panel shares that scepticism, please.
Okay, it's not because they're bad people, but the leopard doesn't change its spots. I think there are structural problems to do with central government which make it very hard to lead in the long-term consistent way that we need it to. Successive governments can't help tinkering, and that inevitably makes things worse, in my view.
So yeah, I think it was really welcome to see the changes that have been announced in relation to onshore wind, and that was a really interesting one because that had been banned by previous Tory government because the view was that it wasn't popular amongst people who might be choosing to vote for them, but they now obviously have taken a different view, which I think suggests partly that there is some sense in which the discussion has changed and that there's a recognition that the public view on this has moved, but also that they feel that they're in a space now where that they can get acceptance for those sorts of changes. And it's true to say that there are some actions that they are taking or proposing to take that are welcome. So the Conservative manifesto set aside 9.5 billion, so 2.5 billion of that is for the Homes Upgrade Grant, and that will be providing support, they say, for about £12,000 per home for people who are in fuel poverty. There's also going to be funding that's supposed to be coming forward for the social housing sector. But it's fair to say that although, if 9.5 billion turned up in my account, I would think that was a lot of money. In terms of the scale of activity that needs to happen, it doesn't even touch the size of it. And so, £12,000 per home in London would be brilliant, but it's still not enough. And so, yes, those things are good, but we need to have the confidence that they are part of a coherent narrative and that they aren't just small-scale actions dotted here and there that are going to allow them to be able to have some good headlines at COP, but that they are part of a wider movement that is commensurate with the scale of the challenge.
Chris, you want to say something?
Yeah, I've engaged my brain now. A couple of other thoughts. I think government tends to focus on supply side rather than demand side historically, and it's much easier for them to support something large and shiny that they can point at, like a wind farm or a nuclear power station or a railway line, than a million homes that aren't consuming quite as much energy as they did. I also think they have a real problem thinking beyond short-term costs to long-term benefits. They're not set up to do that, and supporting retrofit at scale requires that ability to make investments now that may pay off 2, 3, 4 or 5 parliaments down the line.
Yeah, I'm a bit further away from the UK intricacies, I suppose. I think from an outside perspective, there is a short-term and a longer-term thing. I think the short-term is, I think this year and next year is going to be really difficult still. I think the last 2 years have been a bit of a paralysis in policy land because of the Brexit situation. I think it's going to get worse this year, seeing how far away the two views of what the future should be shaped like will be, and it's going to get really painful. So I'm afraid that it's going to be hard to really do something. In the longer term, I think the culture in the UK is different than in all the other European countries that I know something about, is that the market is there is such a strong belief in the market that the government is always more reluctant to play a strong part in shaping that than anywhere else, right? The German government is just fundamentally of the view that it should put money in a direction where it needs to travel. In the UK, that fundamental belief just doesn't exist, right? They believe in individual optimization, creating a collective optimal outcome. There is no evidence to support that that's working, by the way. I don't really know why that is being so tightly and dogmatically entertained, but it's what it is. Yeah, that is not going to change very quickly. So I'm afraid, it's a bit of a vain hope to assume that there will be a structural German support scheme being introduced. It's just not. It's not what you guys like. It's just not what it is.
Thank you, Ron. We've got one more question. The 3 minutes, unless we can finish this in 1.5, it may then come to you.
I want to raise the question of where this leaves most homeowners who aren't in fuel poverty but only want to do this once. I fully get the issue of working with social housing sector first for the economies of scale, building the expertise and so on. And I love your analogy with the building the car. Yes, if I got a plumber and an electrician to build my car, I could never afford it. But as I say, for most homeowners who are just going to do this once, what is the advice now? It feels to me like we should wait.
I'd wait to do most of the things. I think the things that it's sensible to do now are anything to do with reducing the heating demand in the home. Yeah. I think you start there and you look for ways to do that are no regrets, i.e. that won't be impaired by future technologies that you might later install in the home. So in the short term, I think let's just reduce the heat demand in the homes. That's a very good starting place.
Thank you. Last question.
A very quick one. For Energy Sprong, do you have an offer to UK private house owners at the present time?
No. And it also is the answer to the other question. We believe that we need to, as quickly as possible, create a product that is much more desirable for everybody, including private homeowners, to come to the market. But we can't do it overnight, right? So we're launching a market with collective homeowners to develop that technology. But I think the private homeowner market is kind of 5 years behind the social and collective landlords in reality. So, and I agree with what you said. If you can do something about reducing heating, do it, right? That's true. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you to the panel. And a thought from each of you, perhaps a catchphrase from you, each of you. Chris spoke of think big, start small, scale fast. We were encouraged to mind the gap by Sarah. And Ron's all about comfort plans. Somehow, if we can pull those three together, we might find a solution. Please give the panel a round of your thanks.